Emma Carter had always been drawn to the wilderness. The towering pines, the crisp mountain air, the distant call of an eagle soaring overhead. This was where she felt most alive. But on that particular autumn afternoon, deep in the Montana backcountry, the wilderness presented her with something far more unsettling. She had been hiking for hours, following an old logging trail that few travelers dared to take. The forest was unusually quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. Then she heard it, a low, ragged sound, somewhere between a growl and a whimper. Emma froze, her pulse quickening. She scanned the dense thicket ahead, her fingers instinctively tightening around the strap of her backpack. The sound came again, weaker this time. Whatever was making that noise was in pain. Cautiously, she stepped forward, pushing aside the branches until she found herself in a small clearing. And there, lying motionless near the base of a fallen tree, was a massive grizzly bear. The sight sent a jolt of fear through her body. The bear's fur was matted with blood, its breathing slow and labored. Deep claw marks raked across its flank, evidence of a brutal fight, likely with another bear. It didn't take an expert to see that he was dying. Emma knew the rules. When encountering a wild bear, the best course of action was to keep your distance and leave. But as she stared at the helpless creature, something in her refused to turn away. She reached for the bear spray at her hip, just in case, before inching closer. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The bear's ears twitched slightly, but he made no move to rise. He was too weak. Emma knelt a few feet away, assessing the wounds. The gashes were deep, and infection had already begun to set in. If left untreated, he wouldn't last another night. Logic told her to walk away. This was nature's course, and she had no business interfering. But then she met the bear's eyes, dark, weary, and filled with a silent plea. Against all reason, she made her decision. Carefully, she reached into her backpack and pulled out her first aid kit. The antiseptic wipes were laughably inadequate for an animal of this size, but they were better than nothing. She tore a strip from her flannel shirt, doused it with water from her bottle, and began gently cleaning around the wounds. The bear let out a low guttural sound, but he did not lash out. He was watching her, studying her, as if trying to understand this strange human who had chosen to help rather than run. Nightfall was approaching, and Emma knew she couldn't stay in the woods with an injured predator. She made a quick decision. Gathering what supplies she had, she placed some dried meat and water a safe distance from the bear before retreating to the trail. "Hang in there," she whispered before disappearing into the trees. As she hiked back to her cabin, her mind raced with doubt. Had she just made a mistake? Had she interfered where she shouldn't have? But somewhere deep in her heart, she knew she had done the right thing. What she didn't know was that this single act of kindness would one day return to her in the most extraordinary way. Emma returned the next morning, unsure of what she would find. The forest was blanketed in a light mist, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Her heart pounded as she approached the clearing. Would the bear still be there? Would he have survived the night? Or worse, would he see her as a threat now that he had regained some strength? Pushing aside a curtain of low-hanging branches, she saw him. The massive grizzly lay in the same spot, though his position had shifted slightly. The dried meat she had left was gone, and the water bottle had been knocked over, its contents soaked into the ground. But what caught her attention was his eyes, no longer clouded with agony, but sharp and aware. He was watching her. Caution dictated that she leave. Yet, instead, she knelt a few feet away, speaking in a soft, steady voice. "You made it through the night," she murmured, unsure if the bear could understand the reassurance in her tone. The bear made no move to attack. He didn't growl or bare his teeth. Instead, he simply observed her, as though waiting to see what she would do next. Emma reached into her bag, pulling out a fresh strip of cloth and a small bottle of honey. It was a long shot, but she had read once that bears had an instinctive attraction to honey. It might help ease his tension. She dipped her fingers into the golden liquid and placed a small dab onto a rock, then retreated a safe distance. For a long moment, the bear didn't move. Then, with painstaking effort, he extended his massive head forward and sniffed the offering. A thick, black tongue flicked out, tasting the honey, before retreating back into his mouth. Emma exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. Over the next few days, she returned, each time taking slow, careful steps toward gaining the bear's trust. She cleaned his wounds as best she could, left small amounts of food nearby, and never made sudden movements. The bear, in turn, tolerated her presence, an unspoken agreement forming between them. She named him Brutus. It felt fitting for a creature so powerful, yet now so vulnerable. By the fourth day, Brutus began shifting his weight, attempting to stand. His back legs trembled under his weight, and he let out a pained huff before collapsing again. Emma winced, knowing he still had a long way to go. But the fact that he was trying meant that he hadn't given up. That evening, as she prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. As Emma stood to go, Brutus let out a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, but something softer, something almost appreciative. She turned back, meeting his dark eyes. "I'll be back," she whispered. And in that moment, she understood something profound. Trust wasn't given. It was earned. What she didn't realize was just how deep that trust would one day run. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, Emma tending to Brutus's wounds, leaving food a safe distance away, and speaking in soothing tones. Slowly, the bear's strength returned. The deep gashes along his flank began to heal, his breathing grew steadier, and his once dull eyes now glimmered with renewed life. By the second week, Brutus no longer lay motionless in the clearing. He could stand, though unsteady at first, and take a few cautious steps. Emma watched with cautious pride as the massive grizzly reclaimed his strength, testing the boundaries of his healing body. She knew this moment would come. It was what she had hoped for, what she had worked for. And yet, a strange sadness settled in her chest. Soon he would leave. It was inevitable. Brutus was a wild animal, not a pet, not something to be tamed or kept close. His place was in the depths of the untamed forest, beyond the reach of human hands. Emma had always known this, yet the thought of losing sight of him, of never knowing what became of him, felt strangely painful. One morning, she arrived at the clearing to find Brutus standing tall, his powerful legs planted firmly beneath him. He turned at the sound of her approach, his ears twitching in recognition. But there was something different in his stance, a certain readiness that hadn't been there before. Emma set down the food, as she always did, but this time, Brutus didn't move toward it. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, then shifted his gaze toward the dense treeline. A slow realization washed over her. This was it. She swallowed the lump forming in her throat. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she murmured, even though she knew he couldn't answer. Brutus huffed, a deep, throaty sound that almost felt like an acknowledgement. He took a slow step back, then another. His muscles tensed, his instincts calling him home. Emma wanted to reach out, to hold on just a moment longer. Instead, she simply whispered, "Be safe." And then, in a quiet, almost graceful motion, Brutus turned and lumbered into the trees. His massive form disappeared into the shadows, swallowed by the endless wild. Emma stood in the clearing long after he was gone, listening to the fading sounds of the forest. There was no trace of him now, no footprints, no rustling branches. It was as if he had never been there at all. A deep ache settled in her chest. She had done what she could. She had given him a chance. And now he was where he belonged. As she turned to head back home, she forced herself to smile. Perhaps she would never see Brutus again. Or perhaps, just perhaps, fate had other plans. 2 years had passed since Emma last saw Brutus. Life in the Montana wilderness had returned to its usual rhythm, yet she often found herself glancing toward the treeline, half expecting to see the familiar silhouette of the grizzly she once saved. But the forest had swallowed him whole, as it always did with its wild creatures. By now, Brutus would be fully grown, a powerful force of nature. The thought brought her comfort, and an odd sense of loss. She told herself it was foolish to feel that way. He was never hers to keep. Winter had come early this year, bringing brutal snowstorms and plunging temperatures. Emma had stocked up on supplies. ensuring she wouldn't have to travel far during the worst of the season. As the wind howled outside her cabin one evening, she curled up by the fire with a book, the world outside lost in a thick veil of white. Then she heard it, a sound so faint she almost mistook it for the wind. But then it came again, high-pitched, desperate. A cry. Emma sat up, heart pounding. It was the sound of a child. She rushed to the door, grabbing her heavy coat and flashlight before stepping outside. The cold hit her instantly, the wind lashing against her exposed skin. The snowfall was relentless, reducing her visibility to mere feet. "Hello," she called, her voice barely carrying over the storm. No response. But the cry came again, weaker this time. Emma moved forward, pushing through knee-deep snow, following the sound. Her pulse raced. What was a child doing out here in the middle of a blizzard? Then, through the swirling white, she saw a massive shape. Her breath caught in her throat. A bear. Her fingers instinctively went to the bear, spray at her hip. But then the beam of her flashlight cut through the snow, illuminating the scene before her, and what she saw nearly brought her to her knees. Brutus. There was no mistaking him. His sheer size, the deep scar along his flank. It was him. And he wasn't alone. At his feet, half buried in the snow, was a small girl. Emma's heart pounded. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the child. Her tiny frame was trembling violently, her lips pale and cracked from the cold. She couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. Emma scooped the girl into her arms, quickly checking her pulse. She was alive, but barely conscious. "It's okay, sweetheart, I've got you," she whispered, wrapping her coat around the child's fragile body. Brutus let out a low rumble, stepping back as Emma lifted the girl. Snow clung to his thick fur, his breath coming in heavy puffs of steam. Emma looked up at him, barely able to process what was happening. Had he found her? Had he saved her? Tears burned in her eyes as she met Brutus's gaze. "You brought her to me," she murmured, her voice breaking. The bear let out a deep huff, then, just as he had done years before, turned and disappeared into the storm. Emma wanted to call out to stop him, but there was no time. The child in her arms needed warmth, needed safety. Holding the girl tightly against her chest, Emma turned and ran back toward the cabin, her mind racing with a single, undeniable truth. Brutus had not forgotten. He had come back, not for himself, but for her. And in that moment, Emma realized that some bonds, no matter how wild, could never truly be broken. Emma burst through the cabin door, snow swirling in behind her as she carried the unconscious child inside. The warmth hit her like a wave, but the little girl in her arms remained limp, her skin ice cold. Moving quickly, Emma set her down by the fireplace, grabbing blankets and wrapping them tightly around the frail body. She checked for signs of frostbite. Her fingers and toes were stiff, her lips tinged blue, but she was still breathing. That was all that mattered. "Come on, sweetheart," Emma murmured, rubbing warmth into the girl's small hands. "Stay with me." She grabbed a kettle and set water to boil, her mind racing. Who was this child? How had she ended up alone in the middle of a blizzard? And more impossibly, how had Brutus found her? The memory of the massive grizzly standing over the girl sent a shiver through Emma, but not from fear. The bear she had once saved had returned, not for himself, but to bring this child to safety. A miracle. A weak cough pulled her from her thoughts. The little girl's eyelashes fluttered, and her tiny fingers twitched beneath the layers of blankets. Then, slowly, her eyes opened, frightened, confused, but alive. Emma exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Hey there," she said softly, brushing damp curls from the child's forehead. "You're safe now." The girl blinked up at her, her lips trembling. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she croaked, "Bear." Emma felt her chest tighten. "Yes," she said, nodding. "A bear brought you here. Do you remember what happened?" The girl's brows furrowed as if trying to piece it together. "I was lost," she said slowly. "I went to find Mommy. But then it got dark and cold. And then the bear found me." Her tiny voice trembled. "I thought he was going to eat me." Emma's heart clenched. "But he didn't," she said gently. "He kept you safe." The girl nodded slowly, her wide eyes full of something between fear and wonder. "He was big," she whispered. "But he didn't hurt me." Emma swallowed hard, still trying to process it herself. Brutus had done something no wild animal should have done. He had found a lost child and led her to safety. A pounding at the door made Emma jump. She rushed to open it, revealing two frantic figures, bundled in heavy coats, their faces red from the cold. A man and a woman, the girl's parents. "Oh God!" the woman gasped, eyes filling with tears as she saw her daughter. "Lily." Emma stepped aside just as the mother rushed in, scooping the little girl into her arms. The father followed, his breath coming in heavy bursts as he took in the scene. "We've been searching for hours," he said, his voice shaking. "We thought we'd lost her forever." Emma swallowed past the lump in her throat. "She's okay now," she said. The mother looked up, still clutching her daughter. "How did you find her?" she asked, eyes wide with desperate gratitude. Emma hesitated, glancing out the window. The storm had quieted, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Somewhere out there, Brutus had already vanished into the forest. Finally, she turned back to the woman and spoke the only truth she knew. "I didn't," she said softly. "A bear did." The parents stared at her, stunned, but Emma said nothing more. Some things, some miracles, were beyond explanation. She walked to the window, gazing out at the endless trees. She knew she wouldn't see him. Brutus was part of the wild, always had been. But now she understood something she hadn't before. Bonds weren't just built on time. They were built on trust, on kindness, on something deeper than instinct. Brutus had not only remembered her, he had repaid the debt in a way no one would ever believe. And Emma knew, without a doubt, that somewhere in the vast, untamed wilderness, the great bear was watching over her still. In the days that followed, word of the miraculous rescue spread like wildfire. The story of a lone girl lost in a deadly blizzard, saved not by a search party or a passing traveler, but by a bear, captured the imagination of everyone who heard it. At first, few believed it. A wild grizzly leading a child to safety? It sounded impossible. But the girl, Lily, insisted on what she had seen. "He wasn't scary," she told anyone who asked. "He was big, but he didn't hurt me. He just watched me like he was making sure I was okay." Emma found herself at the center of it all. Reporters from local newspapers came knocking, eager to hear the tale firsthand. She told them the truth, how she had once saved Brutus, and how, against all odds, he had returned the favor. Some called it a coincidence. Others dismissed it as exaggeration. But those who lived in the Montana wilderness, the hunters, the rangers, the ones who understood the unspoken laws of nature, knew better. Bears didn't do this. Not unless something deeper, something rare and extraordinary, had been formed. A bond. As winter passed and the snows melted, Emma found herself hiking the same trails again. Every now and then, she would pause, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, half expecting to hear the heavy footsteps of a familiar giant. But Brutus never returned. Perhaps he had moved deeper into the mountains, finding solitude in the untouched wild. Or perhaps he had simply known his purpose had been fulfilled, that their fates had crossed for the last time. Yet his presence lingered. Hikers whispered of a massive grizzly spotted on the edges of the forest, always watching, never threatening. Some claimed to hear distant, low rumbles on quiet nights, like the voice of a guardian just beyond sight. And Emma? She no longer searched for him. She no longer needed to, because she knew, in the deepest part of her heart, that Brutus was out there. Not gone, not lost, just waiting. And perhaps, one day, when she least expected it, he would return again.